It was a Tuesday morning when I opened a letter that didn't belong to me. I can still hear the sound of paper tearing, soft and innocent, like the start of a confession. The envelope was addressed to my neighbor, Mr. Dorsey, who was in the hospital recovering from hip surgery. I had been collecting his mail for 2 weeks, sorting it neatly on my kitchen table between my grocery list and a mug of cold coffee. I wasn't snooping. Not really. I was helping. That's what neighbors do in our town. We help. Even when we're lonely enough to make small mistakes and call them kindness. The envelope was heavier than the others, cream-colored, official-looking, from a law office downtown. I meant only to shuffle it into the right pile. But the corner snagged on a flyer and tore, not much, just enough that the flap lifted. That's when I saw it. My late husband's name typed clearly on the first line, regarding the late Mr. Matthew Cole. For a moment I thought I was hallucinating. I blinked, then blinked again. But it was there, black ink on white paper, 8 years after the accident that took him, 8 years after the funeral casseroles and sympathy cards. 8 years since I'd learned how to sleep on one side of the bed. I should have stopped there, should have sealed it shut and pretended I hadn't seen it, but grief has a way of turning ordinary people into trespassers. I pulled the letter out, slowly, as though gentleness might make it less of a sin. It said there had been a new settlement regarding a construction accident, that new information had surfaced from a witness named Mr. Charles Dorsey, my neighbor, my quiet, gray-haired neighbor who played chess with the kids on Sundays and watered my peonies when I went to visit my daughter. The letter said a payment of $28,000 would be made upon signing the release. 28,000. A number with too many ghosts inside it.my first thought wasn't anger, it was confusion. I couldn't piece the math together. What could my neighbor possibly know about the day my husband fell? It had been ruled an accident. Pure and simple. Faulty scaffolding. No negligence, no foul play. At least that's what the company had told me when they sent me a check so small it felt insulting. I folded the letter, unfolded it again, then set it down on the table. I stared at the words until they blurred. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the clock tick, the faint sound of my own heartbeat. I tried to remember every conversation I'd ever had with Charles, his kindness after the funeral, how he'd offered to mow my lawn, fix my porch light, bring soup. Maybe that soup had been guilt. Maybe every act of kindness since then had been penance. I didn't want to believe it, but belief doesn't always wait for permission. The kettle whistled on the stove, sharp and shrill. I turned it off, but didn't pour the tea. My hands were shaking. I sat at the table for an hour, maybe more, rereading the same few sentences, trying to understand what they meant, what they demanded of me. I thought about my husband's last morning, how he'd kissed my cheek and said the same words he always did before leaving for work. Don't forget to water the ferns, as if we'd have forever for small reminders, as if a man can bargain with time by being kind. By lunchtime, I was still sitting there, the letter under my palm like something alive. I should have felt guilty. But guilt requires certainty, and I was drifting between disbelief and anger like a tide that wouldn't choose a shore.by evening. I had convinced myself to take the letter back, seal it somehow, deliver it to Clara, his niece, and pretend I'd never read it. I even practiced the line I'd say, "I think this one's important. You might want to deliver it to him personally." But when I stood by my door with the envelope in hand, I couldn't move. I thought of all the nights I'd watched Charles trim his hedges under the streetlight, whistling softly, and wondered if he ever thought about what he'd done, if he ever looked across the street at my porch and felt the weight of it. Guilt can live in silence. I know that now. It's patient. It waits until you open the wrong envelope. That night I dreamed about Matt. He was standing by the truck in his work boots, wiping sweat off his forehead, smiling at me the way he always did when he thought I wasn't looking. He said, "You can't build forgiveness with secrets." I woke up before dawn with those words still in my ears, the letter on the nightstand, accusing me.by the next morning. My plan had changed, or maybe I never had one. I got dressed, combed my hair, and drove to the hospital. The road was quiet, lined with blooming dogwoods, the kind Matt used to point out every spring. I told myself I was only going to deliver his mail, but the truth was I wanted answers. The nurse at the front desk told me he was in room 214. Recovering well. I hesitated outside the door. I could hear the television, a game show playing softly. I knocked. He looked smaller in the bed, his skin papery, his smile faint but familiar. Well, I'll be. You didn't have to come all the way here, he said. You already do enough. I held out the stack of envelopes, but my hand didn't let go. I said, you got something about Matt. His smile faltered, just slightly. Matt Cole, I said, my husband, from the site. His eyes changed then, the kind of change you can't fake, not shock, but recognition. I said, what did you tell them? He looked away, his voice quiet. You shouldn't have read that, I said. I shouldn't have had to, he sighed, deep and heavy. It's not what you think, I said. Then tell me what it is. His hand trembled as he adjusted the blanket. I kept my mouth shut for too long. He said, that's all you need to know. But it wasn't. It was nothing and everything. You worked with him, I said. You were there that day, he nodded, his eyes glassy. I was the foreman. The board that gave way wasn't safe, I told the company. They said replace it next week. I said okay, and I've been saying sorry ever since. I said, you could have stopped it, he said. I should have. His voice cracked. You think I don't see him every time I close my eyes? I do. The machines beeped softly between us, measuring heartbeats and lies. I said, you watched him fall, he said. I ran to him. I held him. He said my name. I pressed my hand to my chest. It hurt to breathe. I wanted to hate him. I really did. But he looked like a man already serving a sentence no court could shorten. Why now? I asked, why the letter? He said, the boss is dead. The company folded. I wanted to make it right before I go, I said, with money. He shook his head. It's not money. It's acknowledgement, I said. It's guilt dressed up in a check, he said. Maybe. But guilt's all I've got left to give. I left the hospital without saying goodbye, my chest full of things I couldn't name. Anger, pity, confusion, grief, the old kind and the new kind. I drove past the site where it happened. The lot empty now, weeds growing through the cracks. Someone had built a strip mall next to it. I parked and sat there, watching nothing happen. I tried to picture Matt's last seconds. Whether he knew, whether he was scared, whether he forgave before he hit the ground. I tried to picture Charles's face that day, whether he looked up or away. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and poured one glass. Out of habit, I said another, then laughed at myself. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I walked to the bedroom, looked at the empty half of the bed, and said, he knew, didn't he? He always knew. The shadows didn't answer, but somehow I knew I was right. Matt had been careful, too careful. He'd told me once, they're cutting corners, but I'll keep us safe. He hadn't been angry that day when he left. He'd been tired. Tired of trying to do everyone's job but his own, and maybe tired of pretending good men can't be broken by compromise. When the envelope arrived 2 days later addressed to me, I almost didn't open it. But curiosity is just grief with a different name. It was a check made out to me, signed by Charles's attorney, and a note in his handwriting, shaky but legible. I'm sorry. Build something with it. I put it in the drawer and stared at it for days, then weeks, trying to decide what building forgiveness looked like. When Charles came home, I visited, not out of duty but because I needed to see him alive, still paying the price. He looked up from his porch chair. A blanket over his knees. You got it, he said. Not a question, a statement. I nodded. I don't want your money, I said. He smiled faintly. It's not for you, he said. It's for him, I said. He's gone, he said. Then let it go. Where he would have wanted, I didn't know where that was, not then, but I promised I'd think about it. He reached for my hand, his skin cold and thin. I never stopped seeing him, he said, and I never stopped seeing you. I wanted to hate him again. But hatred felt too heavy to carry anymore. 2 weeks later, he died in his sleep. I did not cry at the funeral. I stood in the third pew with my palms flat on the hymn book while the pastor spoke about kindness and second chances. Clara squeezed my elbow and said thank you for coming as if I had a choice. The choir sang low and warm. Afterward, people filed past with those phrases we use when words run out. He was a good man. He'll be missed. He's with the Lord now. I nodded and smiled and felt the strange lightness of anger leaving the body when it runs out of reasons to stay. Outside on the church steps, the wind tugged at my coat and someone touched my sleeve. It was Earl. a crewman who had worked with Matt and Charles back then. His face was carved by years in sun. He asked if we could talk. I followed him to the side yard where the maple leaves rattled like paper. He said, "I heard you found out about the board." I said I did. He said I should have told you. I should have told everyone. We all knew that Scaffold was a liar. He said the boss kept saying next week, and we kept saying okay because we needed the hours and the insurance. He looked at his boots and said we were good men who did lazy math. I said lazy math kills. He nodded like a man swallowing a stone. He said, "If you want a statement, I'll write it." I said, "I don't know if I want statements anymore. I want the kind of truth that doesn't need notarizing." He said that's the hard kind. The day after the funeral, a rumor started that I had sued Charles on his deathbed. I found out at the grocery store when the cashier bagged my bread slowly and said, "I'm sorry for your loss," in a tone that meant something else. I felt the heat rise in my neck, and I said I didn't sue. She said that's not what Mavis said. I said Mavis sells stamps and gossip at the post office. Sometimes she confuses the two. I went home and sat at the table and wrote a letter to myself I did not mail. It said you are not required to explain your grief to anyone who wouldn't have brought you soup. Then I made soup, because that is what women in my family do when the town gets loud. We boil silence back into food. My daughter Hannah drove down the following weekend with her big city certainty and her small suitcase. She hugged me hard and poured tea like a nurse. Then she asked the question that divides mothers and daughters into careful camps. She asked, "What are you going to do with the money?" I said I haven't decided. She said you could pay off the porch repair and the dental bill. You could finally get the roof done right. You could fix your car heater. Winter is coming and you are not a martyr. I said I was thinking of giving it to the high school carpentry program for safety gear. She blinked, then frowned. She said it was your husband's life and your neighbor's guilt, and you want to give it to a school that forgot to replace the saw blades last year. I said yes, because if the money changes me, it just becomes another accident, but if it changes a rule, it might save a wrist or a knee or a morning. She said you owe yourself comfort. I said I owe Matt a good use of sorrow. She leaned back and looked at me with that weary love adult children have for parents who refuse to be simple. She said, "If you give it away, the town will say you took a payoff. If you keep it, the town will say you cashed in grief." I said the town says a lot of things to keep itself entertained. We walked that afternoon past the empty lot where the scaffold used to stand, where the strip mall throws its long shadow. A for-lease sign leaned like a tired man. A plastic bag skittered across the gravel like a ghost half committed to haunting. Hannah slid her hand into the crook of my arm and asked if I ever walk here on purpose. I said sometimes when I need to remind myself that emptiness can be honest. She said you're not angry enough. I said I was angry for so long my anger turned into architecture. I live inside it like a chapel. She said, "And what happens to the man who ordered next week?" I said he is dead and beyond my court, and if there is a God, he has a better cross-examination than I do. She sighed and said, "I hate the way justice and time refuse to line up." The next twist arrived on a postcard slipped under my door with no stamp. It said in a stiff block print, "Check your husband's accident file at county. Request inspection photos." I stared at the letters as if they might rearrange into mercy. "The county building smells like paper and waiting." The clerk wore a sweater with pumpkins and took pity on my hands. She brought out a folder the size of a slim Bible. Inside were grainy photos, close-ups of splintered planks, a bent bracket, a boot print where it shouldn't have been. The report referenced 2 change orders that were approved then canceled. A margin note in a different pen said, "Call back supplier." Another note said, "Rush bid pressure." I made copies and paid in quarters from the jar by my washing machine. The clerk said, "Do you need a paper clip?" "Sometimes that's all we have to give." I told her a paper clip can keep a life from scattering, and we both pretended that was a normal sentence. That evening, Clara knocked with a tin of cookies and tired eyes. We stood on my porch, the air thin and November cold. She said, "The pastor told me what you did for the school." I hadn't told him, but small towns carry news like electric current. She said thank you, not just for the money, for not making his last month about punishment. I swallowed. And then asked a question I had been avoiding. I asked, "Did he talk about the accident with you?" She nodded. She said sometimes he would start to say Matt's name and then switch to "your husband," like he hadn't earned the right to speak it. She said he kept a list of men who worked for him and put a dot next to their names when he heard they'd gotten new jobs with safer companies. She said he kept a different list of corners he'd agreed to cut. Whenever he remembered a new one, he'd write it down and then go paint someone's porch as if paint and penance were the same lumber. She handed me a folded sheet from his coat pocket. It was a copy of a complaint he'd drafted years ago and never sent. He'd written in the margin, "Not yet, not brave enough." Next week, the church ladies asked me to speak at the safety fundraiser because they said my voice would make people open their wallets and their hearts in that order. I stood at the gym podium in front of metal bleachers and a banner that said, "Build it safer." Kids in shop aprons stood behind tables with models of framing joints and ratings charts. I told them about Matt's hands and the way he tested ladders like you test promises. I told them about Charles's confession and the check and the way guilt sometimes buys tools. I did not give the town its scandal. I gave it a homework assignment. I said, before you donate $1, write down the last time you looked away when a board needed replacing and you told yourself next week. People put their hands in their pockets and took out cash like it was a confession. The shop teacher cried openly and did not apologize. The principal shook my hand and said, "We'll name the kit after him if that's okay." I said that would make him blush in the good way. Gossip still floated like pollen. An anonymous note showed up in my mailbox made of letters cut from catalogs. It said widow takes hush money, then returns it to school to look holy. I laughed a sound I didn't like and pinned the note to my bulletin board under a magnet that says, "Nevertheless." Hannah wanted to post a furious rebuttal on the community page. I told her no. Our town uses the internet like a rock tumbler. It claims to polish, but it mostly chips. I baked another pie and took it to the woman who runs the rumor mill. I asked about her back and her cat and her son who can't hold a job and who, I suspect, cuts corners more than wood. She looked at her shoes and said people just want a story that puts the bad in the right clothes. I said sometimes the bad wears our shoes. She nodded and said, "I'll let this one die." She did not entirely, but the edges dulled. 2 weeks later, Earl brought me a battered notebook from his garage. He said, "I think you should see this." It was the foreman's log from those months, Charles's handwriting, neat and stubborn, notes about weather delays and missing harnesses. A page starred twice said supplier refused replacement without invoice. Boss says not needed. Underneath he had written, "Matt says do it anyway. Good man." I rested my palm on that sentence like a benediction. On the last page he'd written a prayer so simple it made my throat ache. "Lord, let me fix one thing I broke before you ask me about the rest." I copied the page and tucked it in my Bible between Psalms and my electric bill, because that's where all my prayers live now, between poetry and practicalities. In December, the principal invited me to see the new safety cages installed on the school saws. The shop smelled like fresh cut pine and teenage hope. The kids showed me their projects with shy pride. A girl with oil under her nails explained why the old guard was a joke and the new one would stop a dozen stitches. I shook her hand and said, "Build me a shelf that doesn't wobble and I'll pay you twice." She grinned and said, "I'll make you two." On the way out, I saw a flyer for a community build day at the senior center to repair loose rails and cracked steps. I signed my name and wrote 3 words next to it that surprised me. I wrote in memory and then stopped. Then I wrote in memory of Matthew and Charles. I stood there looking at the 2 names beside each other as if they might squabble. They did not. The paper did not burst into flame. It just held ink the way paper is born to do. A few days before Christmas, on a morning so quiet even the birds seemed to whisper, I received another letter from the law office. It said the estate had a small balance from a life insurance policy Charles had never updated. The beneficiary had predeceased. Would I accept the remainder as a donation to the fund? I held the letter and laughed with my whole chest for the first time in months. Not because the world was kind, but because sometimes it circles back with an offering shaped like a second chance. I wrote back yes, and sent a copy of the fund receipt and a note for Clara that said, "Your uncle kept lists. We will spend his last list on guardrails and training and the kind of next week that actually arrives." Christmas Eve, I lit a candle at church and tried to sing through the lump in my throat. After the service, Hal the Marine squeezed my shoulder and said, "Got all the angles covered now?" I said, "Close enough for a man with a scarred truck and a mended mirror." He said, "You did Right, I said I did the next right thing over and over until it looked like a plan. He said that's strategy disguised as mercy. Outside the kids, through snow that disintegrated as it fell, I watched my breath and thought of Matt's advice the year the furnace died. Layer up. Move around. Don't apologize for being cold. January brings a particular kind of honesty to our town, the kind that arrives in the mailbox as property tax bills and catalogs we cannot afford. In that honest light, my decision about the money started to look less like saintliness and more like survival, not of me, but of something Matt would recognize. The habit of saying we instead of I. I took a photo of the Sawguards and sent it to Hannah with a caption. Here's your father buying Christmas. She sent back a heart, and then a picture of her space heater and a joke about inheritance. I told her to keep her toes warm and her opinions warmer. Then came the last turn I did not expect. Clara knocked one icy afternoon and asked if we could walk carefully to her porch. We sat wrapped in blankets like old queens surveying small kingdoms. She said, there's something you should know. Uncle Charlie left a letter for you with the pastor. He didn't want to mail it because he thought you'd burn it. She handed me an envelope with my name in his hand. Inside was 3 pages. The first line said, I do not deserve a pen, but cowardice wastes paper, and I have been cowardly too long. He wrote about the day Matt died with more detail than the report, the way the light came through the gap in the roof, the way Matt inspected the rigging and then looked at him and said this is going to go. He wrote about the exact second he chose the job over the man. It was a nothing moment. A sigh, a shrug, a small kindness to the wrong God. He wrote I did not push him, but I did not pull him back either, and that is the same as a push when you are in charge. He wrote I have tried to buy back that second with 40,000 small ones. Mowing, soup, repairs, silence, none of them add up. He wrote the check is not payment. It is a confession with my name spelled out in numbers. Do not forgive me faster than I have earned. I closed the letter and put it in my coat. I told Clara I would not burn it. I would not frame it either. I would keep it where it could remind me that goodness sometimes loses its footing and falls, and that even falling men can point to safer ground. In February, we held the Community Build Day, a ragtag army of teenagers, retirees, church ladies, and 2 plumbers who insisted on reseating the senior center's toilets, because dignity starts where people don't look. I sanded a splintered rail and thought about Matt's hands. The way he taught me to go with the grain or the board will teach you instead. The boy who led the graffiti cleanup months ago showed up with work gloves and a shy hello. He lifted a heavy box without being asked and set it down gently in front of me. He said my grandma said I should come. I said your grandma is wiser than the internet. He grinned and asked if the cardinal had a name. I said I still call him Red out of habit even though that's not creative. He said some names earn themselves by staying put. In March, the high school invited me to judge a safety poster contest. I walked along the gym wall reading slogans teenagers think will move adults. Stop the chop. Guard the board. Next week isn't a plan. That last one hit me in the knees. A quiet girl in a denim jacket stood nearby, twisting a hair tie around her wrist. I pointed to her poster and said, did you make this? She nodded and said my dad fell off a ladder when I was 9. He didn't die, but his back never forgave him. We pay the price in little ways. He can't tie his shoes on bad days. He can't sit through my concerts. I want other dads to sit. I wrote her name down for a scholarship the fund could cover and went home and cried into the dishwater like a cliche that still works. By April, the rumor mill had spun itself tired. The postcard whisperer shifted back to complaining about the trash pickup schedule. At the farmer's market, the cashier bagged my apples without a sermon. Hal brought me a jar of pickles and said try not to chip a tooth. Hannah came for Easter and we ate ham the size of a small dog and laughed at nothing on purpose, because laughter sometimes needs a rehearsal. On Monday, she said quietly I was wrong. You didn't need the money. You needed a different kind, I said. We always need the kind that buys time. She said you turn money into time for other people. I said maybe that's all money is good for if we are honest. One warm evening I sat on my porch with the letter from Charles, the one I promised not to burn. I read it again, and then I read Matt's old note to me from our first apartment, a grocery list on the back of a love letter, because we were broke and romantic. It said milk, bread, nails, and then it said, "Don't forget to water the ferns," I thought. About how ordinary care is the opposite of negligence, how every day asks for the small right thing done now, not next week. I looked across at Charles's empty porch and felt that strange grace that comes when you finally stop asking grief to be extraordinary. When you let it be a neighbor that comes by, sits for a while, and leaves before dessert. And here is where I tell you the truth that is not tidy. I still wake some mornings angry at men who say next week. I still open my mailbox with a small flinch in case the past has found a stamp. I still look at the truck and see the scar and then the shine and then the scar again. I still want to call Matt to the kitchen for nothing and hear his feet on the tile. I still smell the soup Charles brought and feel the heat of resentment under the steam. I still hold the check stub in my fingers and think about roofs and heaters and how comfort is not the opposite of virtue. And at the same time, I feel the steady quiet of having put something in the world that might outlast both of us, a guard, a rule, a sentence in a shop teacher's head that says not next week. Today.so I will end this part the way I live my days now, with a question that keeps me honest. If a letter arrived in your kitchen that could buy you comfort or buy someone else one less funeral, which would you choose? And what story would you want your neighbors to tell about you when they watched you carry that envelope across the street? Would they say you were right? Or would they say you were kind? And if you are lucky enough to be both on a Tuesday in a small town, will you remember to water the ferns before you go to bed?